September 1943. The emerald hell of Bougainville, Solomon Islands. The air, thick and heavy, tasted like rot and rust. Rain hammered the triple canopy jungle, turning the trails into slick red clay riverbeds. Staff Sergeant Hiroshi Takada, commander of a machine gun nest carved into the hillside, felt the familiar gnawing ache in his belly. For 5 days, his men had subsisted on parched rice and the promise of reinforcement that never came. Their uniforms, once crisp Imperial Army green, were now moldering, tattered rags. They fought a war measured in koku of rice and the dwindling number of artillery shells. Survival was the victory. Comfort was an obscene word. Takeda had watched his division, the 6th Infantry, melt away in the face of the American invasion. Not from bullets alone, but from the invisible enemy: starvation, malaria, and exhaustion. The American advance was not just a line of GIs with M1 Garans, it was an avalanche of logistics. Takeda knew the enemy was formidable, but his true dread was reserved for the vast, impossible machinery behind them. This morning, a patrol brought back 2 captured Americans. Young, clean-shaven, their fatigues were merely dirt-stained, not utterly destroyed like the uniforms of Takeda's men. They were weak from fear and minor wounds, but not from hunger. Takeda had them interrogated separately. He walked toward the main hut, the mud sucking at his worn leather boots. Through the thin walls he heard the clipped, harsh Japanese of the interpreter, followed by the broken, defiant English. He was listening for troop strength, for fire support plans. Instead, the final question, delivered with confusion, cut through the sounds of the jungle. "Repeat that. What did you say the refrigerated ship was carrying?" the interpreter barked. A long, exhausted silence, followed by a quiet, almost dismissive American reply. Takeda stepped closer, straining to hear the response. The interpreter's voice, when it came again, was incredulous, strained by a cognitive dissonance that defied all military reality. He says it was bringing ice cream." Takeda stopped dead in the mud. He dismissed the interpreter and the guards with a sharp gesture. He knelt, his eyes fixing on the ground, struggling to reconcile the word with the reality of war. Ice cream, a confection of milk, sugar, and impossible refrigeration. His men hadn't seen a full bowl of rice in a week. They were preparing to die for the emperor, not for dessert. He stood slowly, the implication chilling him more than the endless rain. The Americans weren't just winning the war, they were fighting a different kind of war altogether. Their logistical tale was not just long, it was luxurious. The realization was a cold, hard psychological blow to a man who lived and fought by the code of austerity. Takeda knew instinctively that this simple fact spoke volumes about the war's ultimate outcome.
Spring 1944. The American Quartermaster Corps Depot, London, England. Back across the globe, in the organized bustle of the British home front, the concept of morale logistics was a well-funded, non-negotiable science. For Major Clarence C.Q. Quinlan, a logistics planner with the U.S. Army's 8th Air Force, the fight wasn't just against the Luftwaffe, it was against the grinding, cumulative weight of homesickness, fear, and fatigue. The official doctrine was simple: a soldier who felt cared for fought better. An exhausted flight crew who saw the effort being expended on their comfort was a crew that returned to the air. The sheer scale was staggering. By 1944, the Quartermaster Corps was managing the shipment of hundreds of thousands of tons of material across the Atlantic. Among the vast inventory of K-rations, ammunition, and jeeps were less obvious items: movies, baseball equipment, and most complex of all, the ingredients and machinery for fresh food. The ultimate symbol of this commitment was the effort dedicated to the dessert: ice cream. Quinlan stood inside a massive, converted warehouse near the docks, reviewing the blueprints for a specialized naval vessel. It wasn't a troop transport or a destroyer. It was an ice cream factory ship, specifically the conversion of a former concrete barge into the USS Ice Cream, unofficial designation, a floating plant capable of churning out 10 gallons of ice cream every minute. The vessel would be fitted with complex refrigeration systems, freezers capable of storing thousands of gallons, and pasteurizing equipment, all to serve soldiers who, in a few months, would be storming the beaches of France. An older British logistics officer, a colonel with a severe look, approached Quinlan. "Major, forgive me, but the sheer cost, the allocation of steel and resources to this luxury, it is unconscionable. We need landing craft. We need fuel drums. Do you Americans truly believe this confectionery is a strategic necessity?" Quinlan didn't flinch. He pointed to a small framed photo on his desk, a black and white image of bomber crews huddled around a tiny makeshift ice cream freezer in a freezing English hangar. Their smiles, genuine and rare, were the answer. "Colonel," Quinlan said, adjusting his tie, "my boys fly 25 missions over Germany. They sit in that aluminum tube, freezing while flak tries to tear them to shreds. They're promised 3 things: home, victory, and a piece of America. That ice cream," he tapped the blueprint, "is not a luxury, it's a psychological weapon. It is proof that a powerful, prosperous nation cares enough about their well-being to solve an impossible problem: refrigeration in a war zone, just for them. It is a prosperous nation caring enough about their well-being to solve an impossible problem: refrigeration in a war zone, just for them. It is a symbol of the abundance they are fighting to protect and what the enemy is desperately lacking. You want to know what makes a democracy fight? It's the promise of a double scoop." The British colonel shook his head slowly, a grudging respect in his eyes. He had seen the stoicism of the British soldier. He was now seeing the relentless, wealth-fueled optimism of the American machine. The conversation was interrupted by a call for Quinlan to review the loading manifest for a supply convoy headed to the Pacific. This one, Quinlan noted, included several portable, diesel-powered freezer units, mobile ice cream plants destined for the heat of the Philippines. The war effort, it seemed, was truly being fueled by frozen dairy.
October 1944, Tacloban Airfield, Leyte, Philippines. The heat was an actual presence, heavy and suffocating, intensified by the churning diesel exhaust. Private First Class Salvatore Sal Marino, barely 20 years old and a former ice cream plant worker from Brooklyn, wiped condensation from the steel skin of his machine. He wasn't carrying a rifle. His weapon was a 2.5-ton utility truck with a custom-built insulated body. Inside, a miniature ice cream factory, a mobile commissary unit designed by the Quartermaster Corps for forward deployment. Marino's unit had just been trucked ashore and was now parked precariously near the perimeter of the newly secured airfield on Leyte. Just days ago, the area had been a contested beachhead. Now, P-38 Lightnings were roaring overhead, establishing air superiority, and Marino's mission was starting. He wasn't fighting the enemy. He was fighting the tropical sun and the constant vibrations of the battlefield. His task was simple but logistically absurd: produce 100 gallons of fresh ice cream daily for the division's forward elements. His equipment was a marvel of wartime engineering. A commercial-grade freezer unit modified with a diesel generator, a high-capacity churn, and vacuum-sealed storage tanks. The ingredients, powdered milk, sugar, and stabilizers, arrived in refrigerated reefer trucks or were flown in on cargo planes. The effort involved to maintain a frozen state in 100-degree humidity was prodigious. The first few batches were a disaster. The heat caused the mixes to separate too quickly. The power surges from the generator were erratic. But Marino, driven by the knowledge that this small comfort was disproportionately important to the exhausted infantrymen returning from the jungle, persisted. He adapted, insulating his unit further with salvaged canvas and repositioning the air intake every few hours to catch the scant breeze. By late afternoon, the first successful batch was ready, a hard frozen vanilla, slightly crystalline, but tasting of cold, pure sugar. As the word spread, a line formed instantly, not of officers, but of frontline infantrymen, their faces caked with mud, their eyes wide with disbelief. A sergeant major, his helmet dented, accepted a scoop and a small paper cup. He didn't speak.
He just closed his eyes, savoring the shock of cold and the taste of home. Just as Marino was finishing the last scoop, 2 American MPs brought forward a small group of Japanese prisoners of war, malnourished, ragged men who had been flushed out of the nearby caves. The MPs were leading them toward a collection point, and the path took them directly past Marino's truck and the line of GIs. The Japanese soldiers stopped, momentarily transfixed. They had been fighting a war of absolute deprivation, where the loss of a single tin of beans was a tragedy. Here, before their eyes, was a pristine white substance being served by a dedicated soldier from a gleaming, humming truck. The Americans were eating ice cream. The absurdity of the scene, the roar of the fighters, the smell of cordite, and the sight of men enjoying a frivolous, refrigerated luxury struck the prisoners into a stunned silence. One older Japanese soldier, his face etched with hardship, dropped his gaze and began to tremble. It was not the American firepower that broke him, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of the enemy's inexhaustible wealth and, more chillingly, their indifference to the cost of luxury.
The psychological impact of American abundance, so clearly embodied by the delivery of ice cream to the front line, did not go unnoticed by military strategists. Years after VJ Day, within the polished halls of the Pentagon, analysts were compiling reports that highlighted morale logistics as a decisive, non-kinetic factor in the war's outcome. The provision of comforts, initially seen by some military traditionalists as extravagant, was now understood as a core element of the Allied operational advantage. A former general, Dwight D. Eisenhower, later commented on the incredible disparity in logistical effort. While the American fighting man was sustained by a supply line that brought him not only basic necessities, but also luxuries like fresh bread, hot coffee, and ice cream, the Japanese soldier was often fighting on a fraction of the caloric intake, dependent on whatever he could forage. This difference was not a detail. It was a gulf that defined the two military philosophies. Intelligence reports from the Pacific Theater detailed the profound shock experienced by captured Japanese personnel. The discovery of floating dry docks, mobile bakeries, and ice cream factory ships became a recurring theme in POW interrogation summaries. One famous account involved the interrogation of a high-ranking Japanese officer captured on Guadalcanal. When questioned about the state of his morale, the officer did not cite the superior firepower of the American artillery or the dominance of the Grumman F-6 F-8 Hellcat. Instead, he spoke of a captured American mess hall menu that listed multiple dessert options, including several flavors of ice cream, all provided fresh. His conclusion, documented in a declassified report, was stark. The nation that could expend such resources on the comfort of its lowest-ranking soldiers was a nation that could never be defeated. The American military was not just fighting for territory, it was demonstrating the overwhelming, inexhaustible power of its entire industrial and economic system, treating the soldiers' morale as a precious national resource worth spending steel, diesel, and transport space on. The legacy of the ice cream ships and mobile freezer units became a blueprint for future military operations. The Quartermaster Corps learned that the symbol of comfort was often as powerful as the item itself. The sight of a freshly scooped cone in the middle of a muddy, malaria-ridden jungle was the most effective piece of propaganda the Americans possessed. It told the Allied soldier that he was valued, and it told the enemy, in a language more chilling than any artillery barrage, that they were fighting a foe whose wealth and industrial capacity transcended the very notion of wartime scarcity. The lesson was integrated. The war for the stomach was inextricably linked to the war for the mind.